Right. Hello, everyone. Today, we're joined by Professor Peter Adamson, and in this session, we'll be discussing his recently published book, The Heirs of Avicenna, which was published last year. So I'll first introduce Professor Peter Adamson. Professor Peter Adamson's primary interest are late ancient philosophy and Arabic philosophy. His two monographs deals with the Arabic version of Plotinus, the so-called theology of Aristotle, and with Al-Kindi. He has devoted articles to several figures of Greek tradition, Aristotle, Plotinus, and Porphyry, and numerous philosophers of the Arabic tradition, including Al-Kindi, Abu Bakr al-Razi, Yahya ibn Adi, Avicenna, and others. He has also edited several books, including most recently In the Age of Averroes, published by Warburg Institute. In 2012, Professor Adamson moved to LMU from King's College London, which is the home of a research project he oversees on natural philosophy in Islamic world, funded by Logician Trust. He is also the host of a very interesting podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. In last year, Professor Adamson released two very interesting books. One is a very short introduction to Ibn Sina, and the other one, the book that we'll be discussing in this session, is The Heirs of Avicenna. So this book is about how Ibn Sina was received in the later Islamic tradition in the 12th and 13th century. So with that, I hand it over to you, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks. Right. So this is, well, actually, I'll show the book. This is what it looks like. So it was, as you can see, it's thick. And perhaps alarmingly, it's only one of 3 volumes that's going to be published. So we already sent volume 2 to the press. Volume 3 will hopefully be ready next year. And so this is subtitled, I don't know if you can see this, but it's subtitled Metaphysics and Theology. So the idea is to collect and translate interesting material from philosophers, theologians, also mystics who lived in the 12th and 13th century CE in the Islamic East. The reason why it's important to say the Islamic East is that it means we're excluding people like Ibn Rushd or Averroes who lived in Muslim Spain, because that would have made the project completely unfeasible. And like I say, it's a long book as it is. There's a lot of material here. And I think maybe before I explain what we did and why, I should perhaps just quickly say Sina himself, or Avicenna. So it's called the Heirs of Avicenna, so the people who carry on the legacy of Avicenna. Um, Actually, I've kind of changed to calling him Ibn Sina all the time and not Avicenna. But the whole time we were working on the project, we were calling him Avicenna, so it was kind of too late to change that. Also, it sounds better, Heirs of Avicenna, instead of Heirs of, yeah, I think. Okay, so anyway, we're talking about Ibn Sina, who lived from the 10th to the 11th century CE. He died in 1038. And he is the most important philosophical figure in the Islamic world. So he sort of plays the role that maybe Aristotle plays in Greek philosophy or Kant plays in modern philosophy. And when I say that, what I mean is nothing about like the actual philosophical positions they took. What I mean is that the tradition that's running up to Ibn Sina is actually very complicated. There's a lot going on. So there's a attempt to revive Neoplatonic ideas in Arabic. There's more kind of straightforward Aristotelianism. There's philosophical engagement with Islamic sources, which is what we usually call Kalam, so theology. But actually, Kalam is very philosophical and contains a lot of philosophical argumentation. So it's this very complicated situation. And actually, I think if Ibn Sina hadn't come along, there'd be no way of knowing what would have happened. It might have continued to be quite a diverse and fluid situation, with perhaps Aristotelians interacting in complicated ways with Neoplatonism and adab, so Arabic literature, and so on. But instead, Ibn Sina does come along, and he's a real kind of marking point within the whole Islamic intellectual tradition. So what happens is that after Ibn Sina, everyone, first of all, kind of stops paying attention to Aristotle and other Greek sources, except out in Muslim Spain, where Ibn Rushd is still commenting on Aristotle. And so is Ibn Bajjah, but that's kind of a marginal phenomenon, both intellectually and geographically, right? So way out in the West. in the heartlands of the Islamic world, so in the Islamic East, and there I mean basically I mean like everything from, let's say, Iraq over to modern day Afghanistan. In those regions, basically people transfer their attention to Ibn Sina. And the example I always give here is that when Al-Ghazali wrote his famous Tahafut al-Falasifa, what he means by that is that he's attacking Ibn Sina, not that he's attacking Aristotle. So this is a kind of sign that Ibn Sina is now the fundamental figure who represents philosophy in the Islamic world. And that means that the whole tradition needs to kind of reorient itself around grappling with his ideas. And that's exactly what happened. So very much as, for example, German philosophy after Kant, in fact, modern philosophy as a whole after Kant, basically just becomes a big everyone concerned to deal with Kant. So here, philosophy in the Islamic world becomes a big everyone concerned to deal with in Sina. And people do this in a wide variety of ways, and that's really what we're trying to chart in this book. So when I show you like how big it is, what it mostly consists of. So again, I don't know if people can see this, but these are paragraphs sized chunks of translation from Arabic sources mostly, also Persian and very occasionally also Syriac sources. Someone named Bar Hebraeus, who's a Syriac writing Christian author. And the idea is that so not me mostly, but some postdocs who were with this project funded by the German Research Council here for 6 years. They went through this vast amount of literature and picked out representative and philosophically interesting passages, which we then translated. So it's a source book. And some good news here is that both the book is open access. So if you go to the Brill website, you can actually just download it for free. And there's also an online resource where we put up all the Arabic and Persian original text. So that's heirsofAvicenna.net. If you go there, you'll see that you can just download files with all the Arabic. So you get the Arabic and the English all for free. And this is supposed to help people like study this material and maybe also do further research. So that's the project.
So Professor Ibn Sina is the central figure in this book. It's basically how people received his philosophy. So Professor, what were some of the main topics or points where philosophers in the later tradition debated about something that they received from either the debates that happened between falsafa and Kalam in the formative period, or something that someone like Tusi will just write commentaries on it. So what were some of the points that scholars are debating about in the later tradition?
Yeah, that's actually not that easy a question to answer because in a way the answer is everything. So everything Ibn Sina talks about in his philosophy becomes a topic of debate. And that's why actually this volume is on metaphysics and theology. And I think a lot of the topics people would probably think of most readily are in metaphysics and theology, like how does God relate to the world? What is the nature of being? Stuff like that. I'll talk about that more in a second. But we have 2 more volumes coming, which are going to be at least as long as this one. One is on logic and epistemology, and the other physics and psychology. So you can basically pick any topic from Ibn Sina's philosophy, and there's a vast amount of debate that goes on about it later. And we're talking about very technical things here. So, for example, his theory about the logical status of sentences with modal operators, like sentences that are necessarily true as opposed to contingently true, or that are not possibly true. There's a whole logical theory about how to deal with sentences like that and how they interact with each other to create syllogistic arguments. And we have a whole chapter about that in the logic volume. So that I'm just picking that example because it's very technical. Or you might have, for example, the fact that he postulates a new capacity that no one had talked about before in the brains of humans and animals called the wahm, which is a faculty for grasping the features of objects in the environment that can't be directly accessed through the external senses. So his famous example is a sheep perceiving the hostility of a wolf. And we have a whole chapter on what people say about this faculty of wahm, right? So, I mean, we could sit here all day talking about all this. I mean, the 3 volumes all together are probably going to be something like 2,500 pages of translations and explanations of what's going on. So there's a lot to say. But if I had to name just a few of the main things, maybe I'll pick one from logic, one from epistemology, one from physics, and one from psychology. And then we can get back to the metaphysics stuff, which is what's published in this volume. Okay, so logic, I would say the main issue, one of the main issues is thinking about what happens if you assume something impossible is true. So for example, let's assume that there's a human made of stone, like not a stone statue, but a real human made of stone. Okay, well, what would follow from that logically? And there's a philosopher, Logician and Khunaji, who's very interested in that question. And he tries to introduce that into the Avicennan logical project. This is a very interesting and innovative move that's made in our period. And that's an example from logic. Example from epistemology would be that in the earlier Kalam theological tradition, they define knowledge as a relation between the mind and something in the world, right? So you've got the mind or the soul or whatever you want to call it, the person, the knower, and then you've got an object of knowledge. Knowledge is a relation between them, okay, which sounds reasonable. Whereas Ibn Sina says that knowledge is receiving the form of the object in the mind. So that those two things sound both plausible, right? So if I'm knowing something, I'm related to it. That sounds right. You might also think, well, if I'm knowing something, I have a representation of it in the mind. But these philosophers later on, they see these as two very different theories. And they're right, actually, because in the Kalam theory, what you really are saying is that knowledge is a kind of connection between the mind and the thing. Whereas in the Avicennan theory, knowledge is really a phenomenon that's happening in the mind, namely that it's received a form, okay? And they well, in that case, what you're knowing is the representation in the mind and not the actual object in the world. And then there's knock-on effects for how God's knowledge would work, for example. So that would be another case where we have a very extensive body of evidence against Ibn Sina. In physics, a very obvious example would be the eternity of the universe. We're going to have several chapters on that in volume 3. And that's something that we're familiar with from Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers. So he thought that it was completely appalling that it was committed to the eternity of the universe. He says, no, God creates the universe with a first moment in time. And then there's this massive body of arguments which people use to try to for or against the eternity of the world. And in psychology, the theory of the soul, one of the most interesting debates, which again has a lot of kind of knock-on effects for other topics, would that Ibn Sina follows Aristotle in thinking of the soul as having a whole bunch of different powers or faculties. So the Arabic here is kuwan. And each faculty, kuwa, is a power to take on a certain form, right? Like I was saying before. So the intellect is a power to take on intelligible forms like universal ideas. The imagination is a power to devise and take on imaginative forms. The sense faculties are powers to take on forms like a visual image or whatever it would be. And so you get this picture of the human person as a body with a whole bunch of faculties, a whole bunch of powers. And these powers are basically what the soul is. And then later, philosophers in our period, in the 12th and 13th century, they say, well, no, that's not really right. Because actually, what you've got is a single self, which can variously pay attention to different kinds of things. So instead of sort of breaking apart the mind or the person into a whole bunch of different faculties or powers, we want to think about the mind or the self as a single power. Imaginative objects or whatever it might be. But we don't like this kind of multiplicity inside the soul. So those would be examples from logic, epistemology, physics, psychology. So these are things that will be discussed in the volumes that haven't appeared yet, but will be appearing very soon.
Professor, I want to talk a little bit. I want you to talk about the history of this philosophical development that happens. So in the introduction, you talk about how basically, you basically describe the path to the the post-Avicennan period. So you said that there's the prehistory where we have Al-Farabi and Al-Kindi, where falsafa was first introduced, and on the other hand, we have the Kalam tradition, which is also emerging. And if I remember correctly from your other book, Philosophy in Islamic World, you mentioned that Mu'tazili were the original philosophers of Islam because Kalam is supposed to be, I don't know if it's the right way to say it, but like an indigenous sort of a tradition that theologians have, uh, you know, uh, uh, created. But so that's the prehistory, and then you talk about the uh, right, and then there is the period of formation, and that's where we have Imam Ghazali and Ibn Sina and the debates that happen. And then there's this period of culmination, where we have Al-Razi and Suhrwardi. And then there's refinement, where we have someone like Abhari and other scholars who are talking about it. There's one question that I want to ask is that I read an article recently, and the article was arguing that basically Ibn Rushd and Ibn Taymiyyah wrote that Ibn Sina was influenced by the Mutakallimun when it comes to his idea about a necessary and contingent existence. Basically, his argument for God. And the author then concludes that Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Rushd were right, that Ibn Sina was influenced when it comes to this whole distinction between necessary and contingent being good, because Al-Juwayni has that famous argument where he says that everything that is contingent is created, the world is contingent, therefore the world is created. So what are your thoughts on this? And could you explain more about Kalam as a philosophy tradition? Because a lot of people assume Kalam to be a religious sort of a thing, like exclusively, it's exclusive to like the religious text. That's how it's usually perceived.
Yeah, okay. So there's a lot to say there. I'll try to keep it short. So you're right that in the time before Ibn Sina, Kalam is developing in a more or less independent way from falsafa and vice versa. So people like Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi are certainly aware of the Mutakalimun, and they are even sometimes thinking about problems that have become particularly relevant because of the Kalam discussions. And you even find them doing things like structuring their works in imitation of Kalam works, which is something that Ulrich Rudolph pointed out that Farabi does. So there's definitely kind of a mutual awareness, but I agree with Ibn Taymiyyah, which is not something that happens very often, but I agree with Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Rushd that you really get a different thing happening with Ibn Sina, because Ibn Sina really is engaged deeply with Kalam metaphysics, especially, not so much their physics. So for example, he's not an atomist, which the Kalam guys are. So the Mutakalimun are all atomists. They believe in void. He rejects all of that and he thinks it's ridiculous. He has a different epistemology, as already mentioned. But when it comes to meta, an easy way to get into this is to think about the famous problem of whether the non-existent is a thing. So this had been debated for generations before Ibn Sina comes along. In fact, it's been debated even back in the time of Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi. So this sounds like a very kind of abstruse or obscure question. So the question is, if something doesn't exist yet, is it already a thing? So in Arabic, shay. And you're right that in a way, this debate is in the Quran, because the Quran says things like, if God wants a thing, shay, to be, he says to it, be, kun, and then it is, right? So you have this word of command, be, in the Arabic is kun, and then once he commands it to be, then it is. And that looks like it presupposes that this is already a thing, which is kind of there, as it were, in logical space, waiting to be told to exist, right? And the Mu'tazilites is thought about it like that. The Asharites, who are their opponents in Kalam, big debate, which we don't need to get into. So you can think about Ibn Sina's famous essence existence distinction as a response to that debate. Also clearly a response to Aristotelianism, but he's such a genius that he's able to bring the two things together, right? So his idea is, well, from Aristotle, I have this essence, like what it is to be a human. And that essence does not say whether the human would exist or not. So in other words, the human is contingent. It may either exist or not exist. So they talk sometimes about it's like a set of scales that has to be preponderated or pushed in one way rather than the other towards existence rather than not existence. So a human may or may not exist, and then the cause of the human will make it exist rather than not existing. It will preponderate it to exist, right? So in a sense, you could think about the essence as playing the role of the Mu'tazilite non-existent thing. Now, there's further complications there. In particular, Ibn Sina actually doesn't think that anything is non-existent because all the contingent things have been made to exist. And there's some complications around that. But the point is that you can see a kind of, at least a family resemblance between what Ibn Sina was saying and what the Mu'tazila were saying. And post-Avicennan philosophers were absolutely aware of this. So they noticed it immediately. And they will even come out and say things like, well, Ibn Sina just agrees with the Mu'tazilites about this. So they actually thought of him, we think of the main debate as being one within Aristotelianism. Usually historians of philosophy do. We think, okay, well, there's this theory of essence, and then Avicenna comes in and has this theory of existence, which he adds to it. But some of the post-Avicennan thinkers in the Islamic world said, oh, well, there was this ongoing Kalam debate, and then Ibn Sina had a position within it, which is his essence existence distinction. So they just insert him into the history of Kalam on Aristotelianism and Kalam at the same time. That's really the brilliant move that he's making. But you can absolutely see why the later theologians slash philosophers were inclined to see Ibn Sina as bringing into an ongoing Kalam debate.
Yeah, first, and another thing that I've noticed by reading the secondary literature is that um, someone like Imam Razi or Al-Amidi or even Al-Abhari later on, they are writing books in the genre of what becomes hikma. Like first is falsafa and then it becomes hikma. I've read that the term falsafa as a people do not consider themselves falasifa because I guess after the intervention of Imam Ghazali, people move away from this label and then they adopt the term hikmah for them. So then the philosophers slash theologians are writing book in the genre of hikmah and kalam, which are both philosophical traditions. And what's interesting about this is that, and you mentioned this in your book as well, is that the conclusions of both the books, the assumptions are different and the conclusions are contradictory. And so then the question arises that why is it so that one author is writing books in two philosophical genres and the conclusions are very different? They are contradictory in some sense. So why is it this the case that in the post-Avicennan or after the intervention of Imam Ghazali, let's say, there are philosophers, or in the post-classical tradition, there are philosophers who are writing books in two genres, and the conclusions are contradicting each other. So why does this phenomenon emerge?
Yeah, so this is something that's been argued in a recent book by Frank Griffel called, I think, The Formation of Post-Classical Philosophy,
Yeah,
or
yeah, I
something
basically
like
read
that.
that. You also mentioned this in your book, but you talk about Al-Abhari, but he was the first one who talked about this, that he was talking about Al-Razi, which is like the main protagonist of the book. So,
Yeah, right. Right. So Frank Griffel has this very strong thesis that you can kind of sort works from the post-Avicennan tradition, at least for this period, so maybe 12th, 13th, 14th century, into different genres, as you said. So like we have the hikma genre and the kalam genre. Um, and hikma would be something like philosophy, maybe in a more or less Avicennan spirit. And kalam obviously would usually be like Ashari kalam. And so, for example, in a hikma work, you might defend a non-atomist physics, and you might say that the universe is eternal. But in a kalam work, you might defend an atomist physics and say that the world is not eternal, right? So I think actually it's an open question how true that is. And it's a question that we need to ask about individual thinkers and about the period as a whole. So one of the big debates has concerned Fakhruddin Al-Razi, who's one of the most important thinkers that we look at. So he's quoted extensively in every chapter in all three volumes, I think. He's like, in a way, he set out to be the new Ibn Sina of his own age, and he kind of succeeded because he becomes very influential. I don't think he disciplined Sina as a crucial figure the way that Ibn Sina replaced Aristotle, but he makes some progress towards doing that. By the way, parenthetically, this seems to be a phenomenon of 12th century philosophy in the Islamic world. So we have three figures who come along and try to sort of set themselves up as the big new philosopher, who's like the new Ibn Sina. Suhrwardi and Fakhruddin Razi. So these three guys all write numerous works. I mean, Barakat basically one big book called the Mu'tabar, but Suhrwardi and Razi both write lots of works, which are very systematic and engage in a very detailed way with Ibn Sina's philosophy. Suhrwardi even creates a new set of vocabulary and labels for what he's doing. So he calls what he's doing illuminationist philosophy, even though to a large extent it's basically we're seeing in other philosophers of the time. We have this idea in Abu like critically rethinking the entire Avicennan system in Kitab al-Mu'tabar. That's actually what Mu'tabar means. It's the book of the carefully considered. And then we have Fakhruddin, who is more allied with the Asharite theological school than these other two figures were, and who is maybe more inclined to think deeply about the relationship between Avicenna and falsafa and Asharite Kalam. Okay. So then there's a debate about Fakhruddin that's going on in the secondary literature, so in the scholarly field now. So you have a very clear position taken by Frank Griffel. So Frank really thinks that you can basically assign each of Fakhruddin's works to either Kalam or Hikmah, and that it's characteristic of these works that they sort of maybe audiences or take different positions. But Ayman Shihadeh, who's also an expert on Fakhruddin, is inclined to see Fakhruddin's work. So he sees much more doctrinal continuity between Fakhruddin's different writings. So I think that's a debate that's still going on, as it were. But whatever the scholars decide about that, I think it is certainly true that they're drawing on different kinds of intellectual tradition here, and they're aware of that. To call someone a philosopher is really to say they're an Avicennan philosopher. Whereas to just do hikmah is much kind of more open-ended. And to do kalam is again to be an Asharite, usually, right? So not a Mu'tazilite. Most of these guys would be Asharites insofar as they're doing kalam. And if it's true that different works are written in different genres and occupy different like intellectual positions, it might be even just because they're trying to teach their students the different ways of thinking about this stuff, right? So you might write a kind of introduction to kalam that might actually be a very detailed introduction, and it would be to help students to kind of think their way through the kalam system. Or you might write a work like the Mabahith of Fakhruddin seems to be like this. So the Mabahith is an early work by Fakhruddin, which is very closely based on Avicenna philosophy. But then if you look at, for example, like his last huge treatise, which is probably the one we draw on the most, Fakhruddin's, I mean, is the Matalib al-Aliyah. And in that, I think it would be very difficult to say that it's either a Kalam work or a falsafa work or hikma. It's much more like him giving you his final verdict on some big debate, right? And then one last thing I'll say about this is that in the Matalib, but also, and this is not true of only of Fakhruddin, it's true of a lot of these different authors, it's not always necessarily the case that they're very interested in telling you what they think about the debate. They might be more interested in just explaining to you what the debate is. So what are all the different moves that are made? So something that Fakhruddin will very often do is he'll spend like 20 pages explaining every argument that's been given on every side of an issue. And then at the end, he'll either just say, but God knows best, or he'll give you like half a page where he says, well, I think a persuasive argument on this is the following. And then he'll say, but God knows best, right? So I think it might even be fair to say that Adin was, at least in some of his works, just more interested in understanding the kind of dialectic of certain philosophical argument was being debated in his time than that he was like in the business of giving doctrinal positions that actually answer a question. Um, but on the other hand, Suhrwardi, I think, is much more inclined to adopt a clear doctrinal position. So I think it was really something that needs to be sorted out, like author by author, book by book. And what we say about Ahmadi or Abhari is not necessarily going to apply to Fakhruddin or Suhrwardi, and vice versa.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Professor. What you said at the end, it reminded me of the episode on Al-Razi, Fakhruddin Al-Razi, on the history of philosophy without any gaps. So that the episode in Fakhruddin Al-Razi is called "For the Sake of Argument," and you mentioned how Al-Razi would basically, explain the whole thing, like argument, counter-argument, counter-argument, and at the end of it, he will not decide which position he has taken. So. Professor, one other question that I had, and this is related to, uh, it's more about the institutional context of the scholarly tradition that is happening and the philosophical development that is happening. So in the 12th century, or let's say in the 13th century, when we have Tusi, Abhari, and others, how are the scholars interacting? Like, what is the institutional context? Are they just like, alone in their, ivory towers, or is there like an institution, a college where they're interacting and, they're doing this research?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think this is something that more research is needed to really understand. But I can say a few things about it. So first of all, back all the way back in the time of Ghazali, so early on the 12th century, or so around the turn of the 12th century, the great Vizier Nizam al-Mulk sets up this system of madrasas, the so-called Nizamiya madrasas. And these are, you might call them the first institutions of higher learning in Islam. And that's very important for the propagation of Avicenna's philosophy, because even if some of the like, for example, on the essence existence distinction or on God's creating the world or whatever, some of those are very controversial, to put it mildly. His logic becomes extremely well embraced by everybody. And even Ghazali says only an idiot backed the study of logic. Like, you absolutely need to do logic. Maybe partially because of Ghazali's authority, in fact, becomes a kind of standard topic to study in the madrasas. So even people who are really training jurists or theologians, but jurists are maybe more important culturally, they would learn logic. The logic they would learn would basically be Avicennan logic. Now they might not go further into Ibn Sina's philosophy than that, but at least at the level of logic, we have a very pervasive institutional, kind of pervasive and stable institutional basis for doing Avicennan philosophy. This is something we could compare to what happens in Latin Europe, Latin Christian Europe, where a lot of people would go to the universities already as teenagers and maybe only study Aristotelian logic and not do any more philosophy than that. So it's a kind of similar situation. So that's the first thing. Obviously, madrasas then become a context in which you can go on to think about metaphysics or psychology or the eternity of the world, whatever it might be. And we know that all of our philosophers study with certain masters. So, for example, one interesting thing is Suhrwardi and Fakhreddin studied with the same master for at least a time, which might explain why they have so many similarities in their thought and approach. Um, and in general, it seems that people would actually travel around. Fakhreddin did this. They would go to cities, specific cities as young men, and go sit at the feet of a particular master. As time goes on, like once we get into the Ottoman and Safavid period, for example, you have a very well-established practice whereby you actually have a document that is a testimony witnessing to the fact that you studied a certain book with a certain guy. So I studied, Ibn Sina's Isharat with my master so and so, and I actually have a piece of paper that proves it, right? So it's almost like a diploma, and this qualifies you to teach the same work to someone else. They also keep track of student-teacher relationships. So you have this idea of the silsila, the chain of transmission. This is kind of like the chain of transmission in hadith, if people are familiar with that. So just, I know that Muhammad really said this because he told so and so, who told so and so, who told so and so, who told me. So I know, and these people are all trustworthy. So I know Muhammad really said it. So this is how hadith criticism works. Similarly, you have these student-teacher relationships where you can trace your lineage back to some famous philosopher, even Ibn Sina. Sort of like we say in Germany, we talk about Doktorvater, so my doctoral father. But this would be like your doctoral great great grandfather or whatever. Um, so clearly there's a lot of institutional basis for this, but in addition to that, I think there's a lot of informal discussion of these things going on. So we have a text from Fakhreddin, which is about the debates that he had with people traveling around in Central Asia. And you really get the impression that he would arrive in a new city and like find the smartest person in the city and then refute them publicly in a debate. That's like what he wanted to do. So he's like going all over Asia trying to make smart people look stupid. That's his big project, right, in this work. And he talks about he actually writes down kind of a summary of the debates he had with different people. And this is something that goes back to the time before the setting up of the madrasas. So we have the so-called majlis, so which is like literally people sitting around and having some kind of conversation. And all kinds of things could happen in a majlis. So people could like, recite poetry or maybe enjoy music or whatever. But one of the things you can do at a majlis is to have an intellectual debate about law, about theology, about the Quran, whatever it is, or about philosophy. So we know that there are a whole bunch of records of majlis debates even before the time of Ibn Sina. Um, and I think this is a context in which a lot of it also got done in the 12th and 13th century in the eastern parts of the Islamic world. So it certainly Fakhreddin was having sort of semi-public debates, maybe in front of a small audience, like at a court of a local warlord or whatever. And he would try to engage with and refute other thinkers. Actually, what we were talking about before, this kind of interest in the dialectic, like why is he so interested in arguments before and for and against everything? You could even think about that as a text that's training you to do this, right? So if you're confronted with someone who denies the eternity of the world, then here are 17 arguments for the eternity of the world. So you could pick your 3 or 4 favorite ones and throw this at the opponent. But also you want to know what can be said on the opponent's side, right? Like what if you're confronted with someone who agrees with the eternity of the world? Or you just want to know what the opponent is going to argue and you want to know how to argue against that. So this idea of like back and forth arguing, I think that might be one reason why Fakhreddin wrote the way he did, is that he was trying to prepare himself and his readers.
Right. Professor, another question I had was that I've read that after Ibn Sina, with the intervention of Imam al-Razi and Khunaji, so if you talk about the logic tradition, with the intervention of these two figures, then just as Aristotle was displaced by or replaced by Ibn Sina, and then he becomes the central figure. In the logic tradition, with the intervention of al-Razi and Khunaji, Ibn Sina is also somewhat replaced, and so the later logical commentary, the commentaries that someone like Al-Abhari and others are writing, they are not directly responding to Ibn Sina or writing commentaries on it, but they're writing like super commentaries. And it's particularly the case in North India, where the scholarly tradition goes there, and then the scholars there are, for the most part, they're actually just reading Ibn Sina through the commentary of Tusi, someone else. So is there something similar happen in philosophy as well? That when scholars are writing commentaries, then they're not like directly reading Ibn Sina or responding to it, but like through the lens of a different commentary.
Yeah, that's true. So, and someone else we should mention in the context of logic is Al-Katibi, because
Yes.
Katibi's Shamsiya, which was written for, the reason it's called that is not that he wrote it on a sunny day, it's that it was written for a ruler whose name was Shamsuddin. And this has actually just been translated into English by Tony Street, his books, even to the point that people were still using it as a logical textbook in the 20th century, right? And he's 13th century, so very long-lasting, stable tradition. By the way, parenthetic, um, something you mentioned before we started the recording is that there's this widespread idea that philosophy kind of declined in the later Islamic world.
Yeah.
And actually, the ironic thing is that philosophy in the Islamic world is really very stable in the post-classical era. I mean, if you compare it to what happened in Europe, you don't get a decline, obviously, but you get this complete overhaul and like change during the Enlightenment. So the 17th century marks a real kind of Aristotelian tradition. And what's really striking about the Islamic tradition is that that doesn't really happen. So you
Mhm.
have this long, ongoing kind of style of doing philosophy that really goes back to Ibn Sina, which continues right up through the 19th and even 20th century, even through the time of colonialism, which is quite impressive how stable it is. Anyway, so logic is a part of that. I think logic kind of, in some ways, it starts to develop independently of the rest of philosophy, possibly in part because of what we talked about before, the madrasa system, where you have a lot of students who are only studying logic and not doing the rest. But I think also because of what you just mentioned, which is you have these authors like, for example, Khunaji and Katibi, who are really specialists in logic and didn't really have anything interesting to say about the rest of philosophy. Right. So if you read Katibi's Shamsiya or Khunaji's Kashf, and you're only getting the logic, right? And so it's a self-contained work. It's not like a lot of some larger encyclopedia, the way that the Avicenna's Isharat or Shifa logic, but then they have sections on everything else as well. No, Katabi's Shamsiya is just about logic, right? Is a textbook on logic. And so you have an independent body of literature to engage with that's only about logic. But it's still the case that, for example, Ibn Sina Isharat continues to be commented on in the following centuries, and you get commentaries and super commentaries, and even what Rob Wisnowski suggested calling super duper commentaries. So a commentary on a commentary on a text, right? And this really becomes a very important kind of vehicle for doing intellectual work in the post-classical era. Asad Ahmed Samson, um, and I think we can really kind of, um, and again, more research is needed into this, but I think it would probably be fair to say that we can define certain periods of Islamic intellectual history in terms of which book is being commented on. So, for example, you have like the period where Tuzi's Tajrid is the most important base text or matan for writing commentaries. or you might have other works that are being commented on in Mughal, which is what Asad Ahmed has been working on. But the point is that you have these like fundamental authors, fundamental texts, and then people write commentaries on those texts. They write super commentaries on commentaries on those texts. Something that's really striking is that you even find authors writing a work, which is quite brief, and then writing a commentary of their own on their own work,
Yeah.
the so-called self-commentary, right? And that shows you how common or really how fundamental it was to them to that philosophy should be done in the form of commentaries. Maybe not even just philosophy. I think it's also done in other bodies of literature like law and theology, but philosophy is a good example anyway.
Right. Professor, there's one thing that I've always wondered, uh, and I want to ask you this question. So, would you choose Fakhruddin al-Razi or Khunaji if you had to choose a logic teacher? So, which one would you go for, al-Razi or Khunaji?
That's an interesting question. Um, I think I would want Fakhruddin if I was interested in the way that logic relates to other philosophical topics. But if I only wanted to study logic, I would go with Khunaji. Khunaji is a more, I mean, Fakhruddin is an interesting logician, but he's not as innovative as Khunaji. So Khunaji is really like the most interesting logician in the 12th and 13th century. In fact, so something that I noticed when we were doing these books, the Heirs of Avicenna books, is that in every chapter, things are kind of going along with initial responses to Ibn Sina, and then you get sort of Fakhruddin, and the entire discussion changes. And that happens over and over. It's true for theory of the soul, it's true for the eternity of the world, it's true for metaphysical issues of all kinds, it's true for epistemology, everything, except logic. And in logic, the same thing happens, but with Khunaji. So whatever the topic is, it's always Khunaji is like, well, hang on a second. Is this right? And then he'll make some completely new move. So the one I mentioned before was, well, what if the subject of the sentence is an impossible object? Like what if I'm predicating of round square? So for example, round square is round. That looks true, right? How could round square not be round? But what would that mean? Like what would it how could it be combined with other premises in order to generate syllogisms? That's just one example, but he's very innovative logician really across the board. There's actually a postdoc of mine, or not of mine, but who's here in Munich, in Behnam Zolgada, who's doing a big project on Khunaji's logic, which will kind of present it, and that hopefully will be out in the next year or two, so people can see more then.
Yeah, I've only read, I mean, I've only have I've only read about Professor Ruwayhib's translation of the Juman of Khunaji.
Mhm.
Is this the only logic book that is available of Khunaji, or are there other treatises or books that are also
Yeah, I
relying on
think that
this?
so now Hunaji needs still it would be good if to translate more Hunaji, but we have a lot of it in the logic book that's coming out. The volume two, the volume
Uh,
two of Heirs of Avicenna has numerous passages from Hunaji in every chapter that's about logic. So there'll be a lot of material in there, and that'll be out like within the next half year. So
right,
maybe even by the time people see this, it'll be out.
right. So, first of all, those two volumes would they also be free access?
Yeah, it'll all be open access, and again, we'll put up the Arabic texts online in the same at the same website. Yeah.
That's great. That's really good. And Professor, so the next two volumes that are coming out, are they also limited to the 12th and 13th century?
Yes, yeah. So actually, I mean, an interesting, I mean, if it's quite daunting if you think about it. So, like I said, we're going to have something like, um, yeah, I mean, more than 2,000 pages of material, and it's only the 12th and 13th century.
Yeah.
So we're talking about maybe a couple of dozen philosophers who are quoted there. The main figures are usually, so as background, we always quote Ibn Sina, often Ghazali, some other early critics of Ibn Sina like Masudi, for example. But then the main action is usually with, um, so actually Omar Khayyam comes up a lot in the metaphysics book. which is surprising. So he's more famous as a poet, right? But he actually wrote several interesting works on metaphysics. And then we have Suhrwardi, Barakat, Fakhruddin. They're very interesting. Ahmadi, Abhari, and then the circle around Nasiruddin Tusi. So Tusi himself, and then the various people he was debating with and who were his students, which is a whole bunch of people. Katibi is one of them, actually. So you kind of have these stages, as you were saying before. So we get like the initial reactions to Ibn Sina from Ghazali on. Then we get this moment where Abu Barakat, Fakhruddin, and Suhrwardi really changed the discussion. And then we get a kind of period of maybe more scholastic or technical philosophy in the 13th century, which really culminates with Tusi. But that really only brings us up to the time of, if you want to think about it this way, like what's going on historically, that would be the time of the aftermath of the Mongol invasion, right? And again, like if you believed in the decline narrative, you might think, oh, well, the Mongols just turned up and killed everybody. So that'll be over, right? That'll be philosophy over. But that's certainly not true. So I mean, Tusi actually works for the Mongols, and they're the ones who set him up at Maraga with his observatory, right? And then you get a whole bunch of new major figures in the 14th century. So you have Iji, Taftazani, and Baidawi, who seem to be the three main kind of Eastern theologian philosophers who would need to be considered for that period. And then if you kind of move forward a little bit, you could think about like the school of Shiraz towards the end of the 15th century, where you have Dawani and the two Dashtakis, who are kind of paving the way for Safavid philosophy. And then you move on into the time of Mulla Sadra and so on. So I think actually, to my mind, once the Heirs of Avicenna is complete, and with what other scholars have been doing, like Haider and Eichner, Ayman Shihadeh, and others, Frank Griffel, as we mentioned before, we'll have a pretty good understanding of 12th and 13th century philosophy. A lot still to do for sure. But the 14th and 15th centuries, people have not really worked on this very much, especially in Western languages. So that would, I mean, you could almost do the whole Heirs of Avicenna, or you could do the whole Heirs of Avicenna project again and do 3 more volumes on the 14th and 15th century. I'm pretty sure I won't do that because I don't think I could face it, but somebody should do it. Definitely. The
Right.
heirs of Avicenna, maybe.
Yeah. And first, another important point would be to make sure that this information is, made available to the public and also explained so that the decline narratives and the thesis, which are also in some way like blocking, like they're an obstacle in the way for people to actually read, what actually happened in Islamic history. So one important step would be to make sure that the public is, aware about these things. So I think that if the Heirs of Avicenna, because it is available, it's free access and people can read it, and there's a group of people on social media who are promoting it. So then it's possible that the decline thesis, which to a certain degree has declined, like the decline thesis has a decline in the popular media. Like a lot of changes have happened, but I think we need to keep up the momentum so that the public discourse is the academia is like more accessible to the
Yeah.
public. And this is something that I'm doing in context of Pakistan.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So it's really great that you're doing this. I mean, I think it's natural that, as it were, like the public understanding of something would always lag behind expert opinion. I mean, that's just how it goes. Like it takes a while for the news to kind of percolate out. But I think in this case, it's a particularly kind of stubborn
Yeah.
narrative. One reason is that people like it because there's this perceived kind of lagging behind of the Muslim world relative to Europe, which actually Muslim intellectuals were very interested in themselves, starting in the 19th century, right? So you have for example, in the Ottoman Empire, in the days when the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe, right? Where a lot of Ottoman intellectuals, and also throughout the Ottoman Empire, like in Egypt, you have a lot of intellectuals explicitly raising the question, why has Europe overtaken us? So the Muslim world used to be on top in whatever the 10th, 11th centuries, and now we're not. Now Europe has taken the lead in all kinds of ways, militarily, economically, technologically. What happened, right? And so the decline narrative, even though it's not accurate, was sometimes used as a kind of explanation for at least the beginning of the problem, right? And I
Yeah.
think people still sort of reach for it in that context. When they're talking about something like, why why are we having such difficulty setting up genuine democracies in the Islamic world? Well, it's because the Islamic world's been declining ever since the 12th century or something, which sounds, actually, when you say it out loud, it sounds like it's just such a stupid thing to say, but people still think it, like, at some level they think it because they haven't thought through how stupid it is, right? So there's that problem. And then I think another problem actually has to do with the nature of the material itself. So one thing is that these names are just not well known. And that maybe it's almost a problem that there's too many of them, right? So like it's kind of hard to get the general public to learn about. I mean, so maybe people kind of know who Ghazali is and they kind of know who Averroes is, but that's about it,
Yeah.
right? And then if you go to the general public and say, okay, well, there's Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi, Suhrwardi, Al-Razi, Nasiruddin Husi, and his students. They're already like, wait, hold on a second. Who are what? I can't. What are these names? What's going on here, right? So these people are not famous. Their works are not translated, right? I think actually, so I personally think that in the next like 10, 20 years, the figure who will kind of emerge as someone who people have heard of, at least in philosophy circles, will be Fakhruddin. So I'm actually working right now I mean, we're in the early stages of a book which is going to collect a bunch of essays on Fakhruddin al-Razi to kind of present him to a broader philosophical audience.
Right.
And the idea to sort of pick him out as like the guy you should know
Wow.
is kind of unfair, and but it also makes sense. So he's the best philosopher, in my opinion, in the 12th century. He's a better philosopher than Suhrwardi, even just in terms of like the depth and precision and sophistication of the philosophical moves he can make. He's a more interesting philosopher. He ranges across every single philosophical topic, right? So I think it would help to like get at least maybe his name and Suhrwardi's name more generally known.
Mhm.
Maybe Tuzi as well. People maybe have heard of him more as an astronomer than a philosopher.
Yeah.
And then, but then I think the other challenge, and you'll see this when you dip into the Heirs of Avicenna, is that the material is very difficult.
Yes.
So it's very technical. There's a lot of technical terminology. You have this issue about like, complex chains of argument where there's like 16 arguments for a given thesis, and then each argument has counter arguments. So presenting it to a broader audience is a challenge, sort of in the same way that presenting Latin scholasticism is a challenge.
Right.
So like you can tell people, oh, Duns Scotus is really, really cool and very brilliant philosopher. But if you sit down and try to read Duns Scotus, you're going to be like, what is going on here? This is way too difficult. And I think that is a problem with the Heirs of Avicenna too. So we always have in each chapter, we have like an introductory overview of what's going on to try to make it comprehensible. And hopefully if you read that, you can then understand the passages, but the passages are difficult. They're hard to read and they're very, it's formidable philosophy. It's really hard. And
Mhm.
I think you really almost need a training in philosophy to
Yeah.
appreciate it fully.
Yeah. I was gonna ask, Professor, is there something like, are there prerequisites that students should go through? Suppose if like next month in September, if I'm going to arrange a study circle on your book, or basically the mainly the post-classical tradition and focusing on philosophy and theology. So what are some of the prerequisites that you would recommend that students should go through so that they can, comprehend what's going on
Yeah.
in this book?
I mean, ideally, of course, you would kind of start with Aristotle and go right through like the late ancient commentary tradition, Kindi, Farabi, and so on. But I think that's a lot to ask. And actually, in some ways, you can just start with Ibn Sina. So you absolutely need to understand Ibn Sina to understand what's going on here, because that's all they're thinking about. They're deep in Ibn Sina's thought. They're trying to figure out objections to his all the moves he makes and so on. So you absolutely need to understand Avicennan philosophy. of course, it would be helpful to understand where Ibn Sina came from, and especially Aristotle. But in a way, like they're starting with Ibn Sina. They're not starting with Aristotle. So you can kind of get away with just trying to understand Ibn Sina and then understanding how they're reacting to him. But you cannot understand the material without understanding Ibn Sina. That's an absolute must.
Right. And maybe a basic grasp of logic as well, and maybe like a little intro to philosophy as well.
Yeah, I mean, actually, you would think so because they all think it's so important, right? But actually, like if you read them talking about something like the powers of the soul or even the essence existence distinction, where contingency and necessity come into it a lot, there really aren't that many times where you're like, oh, I need to like unpack my logical equipment to understand what's going on here. They don't even usually say something that you often see in Latin scholastic philosophy. They don't usually stop and say, oh, by the way, that argument was like a syllogism of the third figure in such and such a mood, right? They could, but they don't do it very often, actually. And I think in a way, so I was saying before that there's a kind of independence of logic from the rest of the material. And in a way, the reverse is also true. So there's been all of these advances in logic, but they're kind of still doing the rest of philosophy with kind of intuitive, like this looks like a plausible argument kind of arguments.
Um,
And that might be in part because Ibn Sina's logic is really set up to produce demonstrative syllogisms, like scientific proofs of things. And they don't usually think that that's possible anyway on these topics. They think that you're more in the business of like giving more or less persuasive accounts of in favor of one position or another. And so actually, I think you can kind of get away without knowing a lot of the technicalities of logic.
mm,
But of course, it wouldn't hurt, right?
right. Makes sense. Right. So, Professor, I've already taken enough of your time. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank
And
you. It's
is
fun.
there anything like last maybe like some advices for the students who are interested in the post-classical period? Any last words you'd like to say to them?
Well, actually, just I mean, this is unfortunately this is going to sound like self-promotion, but if you are trying to like just get a basic grounding in Ibn Sina first, I wrote this very short introduction to Ibn Sina, right, which is available from Oxford University Press, and that's not free, but it's cheap. So it's a little paperback, and I think it costs like $15 or something. So that and you can read that in a weekend quite easily because it's a very short introduction, right? So I think it's 30,000 words long, and you can read it more quickly than it took me to write it. And I think, and hopefully that's like a good orientation, and it would kind of set you up for understanding what's happening in the Heirs of Avicenna. And then if you go into the Heirs of Avicenna book, what I would say is start by reading the introductions to each chapter because they kind of lay out the map for how the whole debate worked. And they actually say which passages are relevant for which points. And then you can jump ahead to the passages and read them.
Right. There's one thing in the book first that it says T1, T3, T4. What does that represent?
Oh, that
Uh,
just means so each chapter has like let's say 30 passages, and we just order them T1, 2, 3, 4. So there's just the order in which the text come. So T stands for text. And so it's just the order in which the passages we've translated comes in that chapter. And then we say you can refer to them like if you say 4T5, that means chapter 4, text 5.
okay, right.
So
Makes
that's
sense.
how we refer to them in the index, for example.
Right, right. Right. So that I'll end the session right here. Thank you
Yeah, I'm
so much
glad we
for
cleared that up.
joining. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining, Professor.
Okay,
Uh,
thanks again.
yeah, I'll stop.